After already spending well over 100 hours on my Golden Demon project, I decided to try something I've never done before on a major section of the model. Doesn't feel like my brightest moment ever. The clock is ticking ever closer to Adepticon 2025, and with it, the Golden Demon painting competition. And somehow, as each day passes, my stress level gets higher and higher. Oh, shit. You'd think that by now I'd realize that because this is a massive model, every single detail that I paint will take way longer than a standard infantry-sized Marine. But really, this project is no different than any other large one you or I have done before. I just need to keep putting in the hours, and for me, that means I need to knock out these biggest sections of the model, so I feel like I'm closer to completion. And today we're going to continue just that, knocking out the last major section of the model, and that is this large flowing skirt that Vizic Scour is wearing. And I'm going to try a technique that I've never really done before, at least not to this level. Because Vizic's skirt is the size of a Barbie's dress, it feels like a lot of space to cover. I went into thinking that this may be a big, boring space in general and would need some variation and something to make it feel interesting. But then I reminded myself that not every section of every model needs to be interesting and needs to be the center of attention. Understanding your focal points and drawing the attention to them is one thing, but you also need to not let those secondary features fight the primary features too much. So while I don't want this skirt to be a focal point of the piece, I also don't want it to be a barren desert wasteland of boringness. So I start not really knowing where I'm going here, other than I don't want it to be a single flat color. I bring out my big synthetic brush and start wet blending some desaturated colors to define the shapes and volumes. Now you may be thinking that this large surface would be an ideal place to bust out an airbrush to put down some colors, mask off what I've already painted, and even bring in some color depth pretty quickly. But I don't think just because you own an airbrush, it's always the best tool for the job, at least for me anyway. I really want to be able to figure out what colors look good mixed together right on the model, and I want to push darker tones into the tight folds of the fabric. I want to create choices on the fly and test out how things will look quickly while making quick adaptations. An airbrush, for all its benefits, can be a cumbersome tool, especially when you're trying to find your way through a paint job and you're not sure exactly where you're going. Every time you have to change colors in an airbrush, it takes a while to clean the thing out, and then going back to a color that you just used after testing a new one kind of frustrates me. If I'm just using a brush and I grab some of that last color on my palette, I can get back to work with that color quickly. I can mix a few colors together and place them right on the model and decide what changes I want to make and where I would decide to go from here. One of the big benefits of an airbrush is the smooth layers of color that I can lay down, but quite frankly, at this point in the paint job, I don't care about smooth. In fact, I actively don't want this to feel perfectly blended or smooth, and in that regard, an airbrush would actively take away from this crusty, weathered, and torn fabric I'm working on. Part of the reason I like using a big brush is because I like to get my hands dirty and really get a feel for the surfaces, the contours, and everything on what I'm painting. This will help me define the direction that I'm trying to take on this fabric, what will make it unique without standing out too much. I thought about making it a wild patchwork of colors since the sculpt already leans into that direction with defined sections of the garment. But I gotta be careful not to take that too far because I don't want this thing to look like a patchwork circus tent. I do like the idea of having slightly different tones to each of these different sections, so I make a note of that for a later step in the painting process I'll explore later. I also toyed with the idea of freehanding some symbols, maybe a big great horned rat face or something else to impress the judges. But again, I think that's too much. I have an idea for freehand on another part of the model that I'm more confident in, and I don't want it to inundate the entire model with freehands instead of just showcasing what makes the model cool. I decided that the approach I'm going to take is to create drama and contrast through texture buildup on this fabric. And maybe you're saying that this doesn't sound interesting or cool enough, but I think if we go for a really realistic look of worn, nasty, tattered fabric, it will bring enough life to the section without overpowering the skin of Vizic. I'm taking lighter versions of our base tone with more and more of our bone color in the mix, and I'm building up the feeling of a worn, aged cloth through a million tiny scratches. Now, you've certainly seen me use texture buildup on models on the channel before, but I've never done it to this level and to the amount of layers and back and forth that this process is going to require. If I have any hope of balancing realism and drama here, I'm gonna have to utilize patience. And as I do so, I'm slowly learning what works for this and what doesn't. The first thing I'm learning here, and it's painful for me to admit, is that thinner paint really works much better for this process. I'm working with about 2 parts water to 1 part paint. I consider this a heavy glazing consistency. I want to see the brush strokes when they dry, but I also want them to fade into the layer beneath them so they don't get too bright too fast. We need to show that this cloth has folds and cracks and creases over years and years of use, and that means we need to slowly build this up with 4 or 5 layers of thin paint instead of 1 to 2 thick layers, which means this is gonna take forever. Again, the sheer quantity of model I have to cover here really factors in how much time this is gonna take. If I was painting a Space Marine cloak in this way, I could knock it out in an hour or so, but not here, and my patience is surely being tested. I found myself needing to step away and take a break from this work every hour or so because I was going cross-eyed by staring at these stupid little scratches on this cloth for what felt like forever. The other thing that I'm learning as I do this is that I not only need to slightly tweak the color mix I use based on the base color underneath, but I also need to focus on building up the dimensions of the shapes of the cloth within these scratches. I kept the areas that wouldn't catch direct light almost completely without scratches and added more and brighter layers to those peaks on each fold. In some ways, this is similar to a standard glazing approach, but instead of using a really thin down glaze to make smooth layers over my surface, I'm using slightly thicker paint and using scratches, lines, and dots to build up that texture bit by bit. And speaking of scratches, I discovered something really interesting about what works and what doesn't here. The key is that you do not want to create any sort of recognizable pattern. You don't want parallel or perpendicular lines. You don't want lines all the same size. You don't want lines that are all straight. You don't want to mash the brush into the model to create a blob either. You do this for enough hours, you come up with your own crazy list of do's and don'ts for drawing lines. You do want to use dots. You do want to swish the brush across the model, barely grazing its surface to create the thinnest of lines, almost like a conductor of an orchestra. Sometimes you sweep and create curves. Sometimes you follow the topography of the surface. Sometimes you just do your best to make the time go by quicker by listening to your favorite podcast, like Trapped Under Plastic, the podcast about miniature painting. Shameless plug, but you should listen to it. Today's video was brought to us by Milanote, an amazing tool that helps organize all sorts of projects, and it's been key to the way that I've approached my Golden Demon project this year. Milanote is a super easy to use software with a bunch of super helpful templates for all sorts of projects, both personal and professional. It allows you to collect notes, images, videos, tasks, and more all in one place. I've already used Milanote for some other mini painting projects like my Skaven army. And since Visic is a Skaven, I added this new Golden Demon board using one of their over 100 built-in templates and connected it to my Skaven army project to take advantage of all the reference art and color schemes I've already created. I don't know about you, but I hate folding in new tasks and steps to my existing workflow, especially in a creative process like miniature painting. Luckily, Milanote is incredibly intuitive and user-friendly. I didn't need to watch any kind of videos to just figure out how it works organically. I've been adding to and evolving the board as the Golden Demon project has progressed, and the software has never slowed me down. This project takes advantage of both the mood board and vision board templates. I've thrown in inspirational artwork and images, finding interesting color schemes for the larger sections and tiny details. And I also get to note all of the paint recipes I use for different sections so I can use them later on in the project or for future paint jobs. So now Milanote is my go-to place to store all of my inspirational and interesting works of art, real-world references, and other miniature paint jobs that I really want to learn from, but it's also a really good place to share and collaborate. Our miniature painting community is all about growing together and having more fun with our hobby. And I just see Milanote as a great tool to aid us in this journey. I've made my boards public, and there's a link down in the video description so you can take a look at all those those recipes and the inspiration I've drawn for yourself. So if you want to spend very little time to make your creative or professional projects that much more successful, check out the link down below to try Milanote for free with no time limit. That's right, you, my viewers, get to use Milanote at no cost for as long as you like, because they stand behind their product and they know you're going to love it. And after all the hours already spent in building up this fabric, we come to the true fear of this entire process. When you haven't done something before and you're not sure how it's going to turn out at the end, you spent all that time on a competition piece and it may not have been worth it. But you got to remember, if you wait until you're an expert at any one technique before you start using it on a model you really care about, you're just never going to use those cool techniques on your cool models. You're never going to be an expert in everything, and anytime you paint a model is an excuse to try something new and just go for it. Once I built the fabric texture up to about 75% of the maximum brightness that I'm hoping to achieve, I decided it's a good time to take a break from the scratches and to start building in some color depth. Now, up until this point, the cloth all looks pretty flat in terms of color. I did my best to add a bit of interesting color work in the initial wet blends, focusing mainly on desaturated green tones. I did this because the skin of Visick is very saturated and eye-catching, and I wanted to contrast that with a more desaturated tone on the skirt. I also used green tones here because it's a complementary color to the orangish red flesh. I'm working on adding more layers of color now, but if I didn't set that foundation of those complementary colors from the very beginning, it's so much more difficult to pull them together at the end without undoing all the texture work we've done up to this point. Now, I'm going to be honest with you here, I kind of went into this step super scared, and I used really thin paints to just faintly tint these sections because I didn't want to undo all that texture work I just finished. Yeah, sometimes it's good to be bold and powerful with your colors, and sometimes you got to dip your toe into the pool to check its temperature before you cannonball in. I think that analogy works here. Maybe. I stick with a variety of warm tones and some greens. Honestly, most of these colors don't make much difference when placed over the work thus far because I was so scared and thinned them down a lot. A few of them are interesting, and I do take that as a small victory. One benefit that this step has, whether these colors end up being really impactful or not, is they do a good job of blending together all of that texture we've built up in the prior step. It helps it fuzz together to a more natural looking transition up to our highlights while still showing a bit of that scratchy, weathered, aged texture that we're going for. One thing I did notice here is that all these washes do add to the overall satin shine of the model, and honestly I'm a bit nervous about putting a matte varnish over this whole thing, maybe messing with the color saturation that I've put on so far. So I'm going to save that decision of whether or not to varnish this model, if it is too shiny or not, until I'm closer to completing the entire piece. That way I'll have more variables to understand if it looks good or it does need a varnish. Whenever I'm in the middle of painting a certain step for a model, I like to take a break, take a step back, and really analyze what's working and what's not. And that when I'm doing that in this point of this model, I get, for the first time, a little bit of sigh of relief. I'm not saying that this thing is the potential to be Golden Demon winning, but I am saying that at this point in the process, I see the potential. I see that it's going in the right direction. Things are working the way that I had hoped, and I need to just keep pushing. So with that, I take a minute to clean up some of the dark lines that got messy from the previous step, and then move on to a bit more accurate and dramatic color depth. My goal here is to use a few tried and true tones that I do have a lot of experience with and I love to use to build up drama in the shadows and add some more interesting color tones. Again, I start with thinner tones in my first few passes just to get a feel for the lay of the land here, but I quickly increase the opacity of my paint so I can add more drama in these interesting shadows. Once I get a bit of the shadows formed with Rhinox Hide, I decide to push the darkest recesses brighter with Doombolt Brown. I really like the look of pushing vibrance into the darkest recesses of your model. It helps bring in dimension to the paint job, and after all, we are painting three-dimensional objects, so the last thing we want to do is to have things look flat and boring. I did do a bit of back and forth between highlighting and adding more tones, but now we're to the final step of really pushing the vibrancy of these scratches to the max, and it's at this point we'll determine if this cloth is worthy of a Golden Demon competition piece or if it's going to need more work. I find it's really good to remind myself in times like these that I'm nearing the end and I just need to keep pushing the paint, but I also cannot rush myself. Since this is the step that needs to be executed cleanly and with exactitude, even though I'm just painting on more scratches, I can't afford to lose my focus here. Luckily, this is also one of the most satisfying steps to paint, that very last step when you're putting something to its level of completion. Every time you finish a small section, you get this small endorphin hit that, wow, that actually did end up looking pretty good. I work with almost pure bone color here with just a bit of Bastion gray mixed in, and work over each section of the cloth, edge highlighting each clean boundary in the sculpt and lightly working back the highlights and volumes that we covered with our wash step. It's extra important here to note which sections of the cloth would catch more light and to push those to pure bone color. All areas will receive this highlight step, but not all will be pushed to the maximum brightness. Some of the areas I do want the brightest are like his butt, because he kind of has a hunched pose, so his butt's up in the air, and also any of the fabric that is facing directly up towards the sky. I did want to take a second to show you the swapping out of my palette paper because it was filled, even though this section of the model actually doesn't use a bunch of different paints. Throughout this paint job, I mixed a lot of slightly different colors, never worrying about exact color matches, and that's an important takeaway from this project, at least for me. Getting the color exactly right is never what you should be worrying about. Instead, you're focusing on what you're trying to achieve, and you do your best to grab a color mix without stressing about it too much. It's gonna look great, it's gonna look like it fits. You've got the colors right there to mix something on the fly that you think will work best. Because after all, the world that we see around us is not composed of perfect little colors out of a bottle. The world around us has variance, subtleties, nuance, and the colors that we see are influenced by all the other colors surrounding it, and that gives us what our eyes perceive. I find that the less time I worry about perfection in color choice, the more time I actually enjoy using color. I'm not worried about picking the right choice, I'm just learning how colors work better and worse together. And with this, we are a little bit closer to finishing this year's Golden Demon project, still with so much more to do. And I think my biggest takeaway from this part of this project is that you don't have to have it all figured out before you begin, because if you wait for that, you'll just never begin. Trying new things, even when we don't know how they're going to turn out, is where we learn the most, and honestly where I get the most satisfaction in miniature painting. It reminds us that the only limits that we have are the ones that we put on ourselves. There were points in this project where you could hear me over the painting footage screaming and swearing at the model, really unhappy with how it looked, and second-guessing whether or not I should start from scratch or even complete this project at all. And that's just doubt creeping up in my mind, and that's okay to have. It happens to all of us. The important thing is that you keep pushing forward, you adjust, you learn, and you find your way to the finish line. Even if it isn't the perfect paint job that you expected it to be, you will have learned something and you'll be a better painter because you went through it. Thanks for joining me in this latest stage of the Golden Demon project. I appreciate you letting me share this with you as I work through this heavy lift. There are a couple other videos in this series that go over the building of the base and the painting of Vizic's skin, and you can check those out as well. There's still so much to do on this project and what feels like so little time, so hopefully you'll join me on the next video as we get closer to completion. And I appreciate your support both in watching these videos and subscribing to the channel. If you wanted to support me in another way to help ensure the channel can keep knocking out these free videos on YouTube, check out the links down below. You can pick up your hobby goodies as well as your models and paints there at a discount, and that helps support the channel. You can also check out the Ninja on Patreon. We've got a bunch of fun rewards that you get, like joining us on the Discord and my new series where I have unedited footage of my Golden Demon project so you can see brushstroke by brushstroke exactly how I do it. Now, I'll be back again next week with another new video. Just be sure that sometime between now and then you find time in your day to slay the gray.